Scary Halloween horror stories. When I arrived, the porch was already watching me. It was the kind of old farmhouse that sits a little too far from the road, set back behind a shiver of trees that hadn't finished losing their leaves. The gravel drive under my tires sounded like teeth grinding. A split-rail fence leaned toward the ditch as though tired of holding the property in place. Every window on the house was dark, the curtains heavy and unmoving, except for the one by the front door. In that pane, on a shallow table, sat a jack-o'-lantern with a candle burning inside it. Its face was simple and old-fashioned. Triangle eyes, a wedge nose, a grin with a few blocky teeth. The light inside trembled like a heartbeat. "You won't miss it," Mrs. Keene had told me when she gave me the key. "And you mustn't touch it, not on Halloween night." I laughed because she didn't. I thought it was part of the house-sitting instructions, like don't let the pipes freeze or water the ferns. Her mouth pinched when I smiled, and she added, "It keeps the road out of the house." I didn't ask what that meant. It was money for a quiet night out of town, far from my cramped apartment and the idiot kids who'd be ringing my bell until midnight. Now, standing on the porch, I remembered her voice and the way she'd slid the brass key across her kitchen table as if it might bite. The key fit the lock with a damp click, and the door drifted inward on a breath of air that smelled like damp earth and old smoke. The house was unfamiliar in the way that empty spaces are when they've held too many lives. There was too much wood floors, wood walls, wood stairs, that made every step of mine speak louder than it should. The entryway had a runner patterned with tiny leaves. My shoes left squeaks on its lacquer. In the living room, a couch lay under a white sheet like a body on a slab. A clock on the mantel ticked too slow, as though the air was heavy in there and time had to push through it. Mrs. Keene had left one lamp on in the kitchen. I found the note beside a thermos. "Help yourself to coffee." The cat answers to Hob. Litter box in the mudroom. Do not let the jack go out. She'd drawn a little circle beside the last line, a circle with two triangles and a jagged mouth. I poured coffee to fight the slant of sleep that always tries to pull me down when I sit somewhere warm. Through the kitchen window I could see the back acre, a field mostly gone to scrub, the weeds tall and seedy and silver with frost. Beyond that a hedge, beyond that the dark line of the old road that loops behind the property like a question someone didn't finish asking. The candle in the pumpkin by the door made a moving patch of light across the floor whenever a draft wandered through. The flame ticked shadows across the ceiling, faint, rhythmic, not unlike the clock's uneven heartbeat. Hob made himself known as cats do. By appearing in the doorway like a thought, I'd finally finished thinking. He was a smoky gray with a white chin and eyes the color of the pumpkin's flame. He wound around my legs, bumping me with his head, then slithered into the next room as if on an errand. The first hour was nothing. The house settled, boards exhaled. I unpacked my overnight bag and placed it on the guest bed where the quilt smelled faintly of cedar. I checked the basement door, locked, the back door, double locked, and the little twisting windows that latched with brass wings. I turned on the television, but the reception fought itself. Every channel was blue snow and whispers. I turned it off and the quiet came down like a blanket. Distantly, a stray firecracker from town or some other late October foolishness. Closer, the moist click of the jack-o'-lantern wick. I tried to read, failed, then wandered the rooms like a bored museum patron. There were old photographs on the hall, grave men in hats, women with eyes like sharpened coins, a boy standing with both hands on a bicycle he seemed unsure how to ride. None of them smiled. Most of the faces were a little overexposed, pale ovals with dark, decisive mouths. It occurred to me, with the comfortless logic that comes late at night, that none of these people had known a world where the road out front was paved, where the sky was cut by power lines, where a cheap smartphone could put the entire world on a rectangle in your palm. For them, the world was smaller and closer, and their defenses against it were likewise primitive. I found myself standing by the front window, looking at the jack-o'-lantern through the glass. Its face seemed different from the porch. The triangles were strangely narrow. The grin pinched. The candle inside fluttered and steadied, like a breath measured against sleep. The draft that carried its scent, wax and something else, something like tallow, brushed the floor, and Hob, who had been sprawled like a spilled garment, sat up very suddenly and stared at the pumpkin with furious attention. "You don't like it, buddy," I said, and the sound of my own voice irritated me. It sounded too loud, too bright. He didn't look away. His tail poured back and forth across the floor. I took my phone from my pocket and tried again for service. 1 bar, then none. Wi-Fi? No. The network name you are trying to join is not in range. Air like wet wool. For some reason, the lack of connection made the house feel larger, as if distance had stretched between me and everything else. I told myself that was what I wanted. I was here to get away. It started with the seeds. When I went back to the kitchen, a scattering of pumpkin seeds lay on the floor by the mudroom door. They hadn't been there when I came in. I would have noticed because they were so clean and white against the dark boards, like teeth. I stared at them longer than necessary, then fetched a paper towel and bent to sweep them up. The seeds were cold. Their surfaces were so slick they nearly slid from my fingers back to the floor. Hob patted in, then changed his mind at the threshold and sat down instead, as if the doorway was a line he couldn't cross. He made a small sound in his throat, a sort of question that wanted to be a warning. I tossed the seeds into the trash under the sink. The trash can smelled like coffee grounds and orange peels. When I let the lid fall, it was louder than it should have been, a slap that made the old clock miss a tick. I went back to the living room. On the small table by the front window, beside the jack-o'-lantern, lay 3 more seeds in a neat row. This was stupid. Someone was playing games. Someone had been here, or had a key, or was creeping through siding and crawl spaces like a raccoon personified. I walked the exterior of the house, my breath fogging and my shoes damp from the grass, the porch boards whispering under me. The field out back, the hedge, the dark length of the old road, night had gathered itself into the shapes of those things, making them more than they were. I listened for footsteps and heard only crickets and the delicate, conspiratorial sound of dry leaves quarreling with themselves. When I re-entered, the air had a new taste, metallic, as if I'd been sucking on a penny. Hob was under the sofa, pupils fat and black. He did not blink. The candle inside the pumpkin was burning lower now, a stub that spat faintly and coated the glass with a thin, greasy film of soot. On the mantel, the second hand of the clock had paused, then clicked backward 1 notch, then forward again. My mouth went dry. I told myself, clocks break, cats overreact, house settle, drafts swirl, seeds from where? The seeds were no longer in the trash. They lay scattered on the counter like a handful thrown by an inattentive fortune-teller, their wet bellies shining. In the center of them, stuck to the counter as if by their own glue, a ring of seeds had arranged themselves into a circle with 2 triangles and a jagged mouth. I wiped it away with a dishcloth, too hard, angrily, because I'd finally embarrassed myself with my own fear. I said aloud, "Enough," and because the house didn't answer, I felt as though I'd won something small and ridiculous. I made more coffee I didn't want. The sound of it filling the mug was too cheerful in the quiet. With the cup warming my hands, I walked back to the hall of photographs. They were the same. Unsmiling faces hung too low on the wall, the frames slightly tilted as if the house had been leaning slowly year after year. But when I came to the picture of the boy with his bicycle, I saw that the pumpkin on the porch was in the glass behind me, a tiny glowing thing reflected in the frame's surface. As I watched, its eyes narrowed. Its smile tightened. I turned around. Through the hall's open mouth, I could see the porch in real time. The Jack's face did not move. The grin was as it had been, the candle's flame collapsing and rising in its chest. But when I turned back to the photograph, the reflected pumpkin had changed again. A new tooth had been cut into its grin. It was longer, slightly bent, a scar of light in an otherwise obedient image. The mug thumped down on the little table next to the picture and splashed hot coffee across my knuckles. That small pain steadied me enough that I could say, now in a lower voice as if it might matter, "Okay, okay." The note in the kitchen had been clear in its peculiar way. Do not let the Jack go out. As if hearing me think it, the candle guttered in a draft that sent a thin, cold hand along the baseboards. The flame shuddered, leaned to one side, then righted itself. The wick had burned into a small, dark crook. I glanced around for spare candles, for matches. I found a box of wooden matches in a drawer, with a pencil stub and a stack of old receipts neatly banded with a brittle rubber loop. The matches were damp to the touch, but they would do. Back in the living room, the Jack stared at me. I stared back. We waited for each other to move. The slow, sticky tick of the mantel clock gave the room a rhythm. The house breathed along with it. I don't know why I did it. Defiance, maybe. The wish to pick at the scab of the night. A childish urge to prove a claim wrong. I leaned forward and blew. The candle went out as if it had been waiting to. The breath of it hit me in the face. Tallow, sweet and animal, like the thrift store coat of a stranger who had stood too long in a butcher's cold room. The dark that followed was a little heavier than it should have been. You could feel it, the way you feel humidity. Behind me, somewhere in the house, the clock snapped forward 3 ticks at once, as though catching up. Then it stopped. The silence was the kind of silence that lets you hear other things, your own blood, the small tremble of your eyelids, and under those sounds, something that wasn't mine. Not footsteps, worse than that. The soft rasp of something with weight moving along uncooperative wood. Not knocking, sliding. As if the wall had been tilted and something on the other side had taken the opportunity to try to come down. Hob bolted from beneath the sofa with such violence he hit the opposite wall, scrambled, vanished under the chair by the window. He didn't hiss. He went perfectly, absolutely quiet. I lit a match. It flared and went out, hissed into a thread of smoke that smelled like sulfur and old eggs. I struck another and took the candle's cold wick in my fingers to nurse the flame to it. The wick drank the fire and spit it away. Wick's dead, I thought stupidly, as if a wick could die. The match burned down to my knuckles and kissed them. I swore and shook my hand like a child. Somewhere in the house something answered that small human sound with one of its own, a drawn-out, careful creak, as if very old knees had decided to stand. The basement, I told myself, because sometimes your mind will hand you a lie for free and you'll take it if it looks the right shape. It's the furnace. But the furnace doesn't scrape. It doesn't lean its weight against the inside of a wall to test whether there's a door it has overlooked. The pumpkin was a dark shape now, its face only negative space, holes punched in the night. Those holes began to fill with a darker dark, as if the night itself had found them appetizing. Triangle eyes, wedge nose, grin. Each hole deepened, and in that depth I thought I saw movement. Not in the room, not at the glass surface of the carved skin, but beyond it, like looking down a well at someone who is looking up. A wet, faint squeak came from the front door. The knob didn't turn. It flexed in its seat, as if tested by a hand that did not care overmuch for handles. The house let a give of air out, the way you sigh when you've remembered something too late. Mrs. Keene's line came back to me. It keeps the road out of the house. Something was trying to come in the way a road comes in, by letting itself be followed with neither hurry nor pause. I scrambled for more matches. 2 broke on striking. The third took, yellow and shaking, and in its light I saw that seeds had appeared again. They lay in a curved line on the floorboards between the front door and the jack, each glossy and pale, a breadcrumb trail back to the grin. The trail ended right at the base of the pumpkin, where tiny scratches marred the wood. The scratches were in a cluster, all pointing toward the open mouth. I did not think. I bent the match to the wick again, whispered nonsense to the tiny stubborn fire, felt the wick resist, felt the flame recoil. It wouldn't take. Wicked, wicked wick. Something about the words snagged, and in the match's last yellow gasp I realized the wick wasn't cotton or string. It was a twist of something fine and black like human hair. The match bit me again and died. The dark swung back in, heavy as wet cloth. The house accepted new weight, a long, slow sag on the floorboards just inside the door, as if something had stepped inside itself, shrugging off distance like a coat. I held my breath, because breathing would have been too loud in that company. Then I heard it, a voice, almost but not quite a voice, clicking itself through the notches it found in the room. Carve me a door, it said, but it said it without air, without the little wet interruptions a throat gives to sound. The words found grips in the place where the jack's face used to shine. Each syllable seemed to arrive on its own damp feet. I backed into the kitchen, one hand on the counter, to steady myself. I remembered the drawer with the matches and the pencil and the receipts. I remembered seeing the bone-handled carving knife in the block by the stove, and Mock laughed at the thought that the universe wanted me to do something as dramatic as cut my way out. But the note had not said keep the door closed. It had said do not let the jack go out. The jack had been a door in reverse, a door you hold closed with light. I grabbed the knife. Its weight was a comfort. Its blade, when I touched it with my thumb, was very sharp. I yanked the back door to the mudroom. On the bench by the boots sat a small pumpkin, uncarved, as perfectly round as a cuffed fist. It must have come from a local patch, skin dusty with the gray bloom you can rub away. I didn't question why it was exactly where I needed it to be. I dragged it into the kitchen and shoved aside a cutting board with an elbow. The first cut made a sound like someone speaking through linen. I sawed a rough lid, dug my fingers inside. The pulp clung in strings that resisted like spider silk. Seeds clinked against the bowl like coins. My hands were slick, my breath too quick, but the rhythm of it, the crude work of hollowing, focused me. It felt like remembering something my hands had always known, but my mind had forgotten. Carve me a door, the house said again, not with impatience, but with the gravity of a river finding a slope. In the other room, the floorboards admitted more weight. The presence moved with neither haste nor hesitation, the way a shadow moves as the sun rushes behind clouds. Hob, somewhere close, made a very small sound, as if he'd remembered pain he hadn't felt yet. I cut a face in the pumpkin, not the old triangles, not the safe kindergarten geometry. My knife made a different smile, long and bowed, with teeth too narrow. I did it like drawing with a shaking hand, not thinking, the blade catching now and then on the rind's knotted grain. Two eyes, not triangles but ovals, yawning, a nose shaped like a keyhole, the mouth unapologetic. I needed a wick. I took the little twist of black from the dead candle. It broke between my fingers and fell apart like ash. Without allowing myself to consider it, I lifted the knife and sawed a small strand from my hair. It hurt more than it should have. It felt as if the hair had been rooted in something other than me. I tied it to a sliver of string stolen from a tea bag I ripped open with my teeth. Then I searched the cupboards for something to feed the flame. Oil, tallow, anything that would burn. There was a blue tin on the top shelf with no label. Inside, pale fat the texture of cold soap. My gorge rose, but I scooped some with my fingers and smeared it around the inside of the pumpkin's lid. The smell of it hit me, the same butcher's cold room scent, the same coin metallic sweetness. It had been used before, often. The matches were down to 4. My hands were so slick they hardly obeyed me. I struck, cupped, touched hair to flame. It caught and then pretended it hadn't, that little traitorous blush vanishing as soon as it appeared. I whispered please without pride. On the third try the wick took, a tiny tongue of fire licking cautiously at the fat. The light inside the pumpkin jumped to life. The new face I'd cut glowed from within like a lantern held up in a cave. At the threshold between the kitchen and the living room, the dark paused. It had reached for the open holes of the old jack, and those holes now offered it nothing. The new face looked back, and for a moment, one pure, insane moment, I understood the trick. Light doesn't push back the dark everywhere. It only shines a signal down a single corridor. It says not here in a language the dark's inertia can comprehend. Carve me a door, that not voice said a third time, and I understood it hadn't been speaking to me or to the house. It had been speaking for itself, convincing its own weight that there would be a door somewhere if it kept asking. But the face I'd made said no. It offered an empty void to one direction and flame to the other. I set the new jack on the floor between rooms like a sentry. The air lightened by a degree. My lungs accepted breath without complaint. The old jack sat dumb beside the door, its face only absence. The house loosened its grip on the idea of me. Something moved down the hall of photographs. Not footsteps, never footsteps. Imagine the shape of a person as a cutout in a page, with the page walking and the cutout remaining where it is, a hole moving through paper. It had weight, and yet it wanted nothing, and that wanting nothing made my skin crawl, because everything I had ever known had wanted something. It came to the edge of the light and stopped as if shy. On the painted wall it printed its shape, not with shadow but with a tremor, a ripple, as though the light itself had to bend around an absence that was stubborn. The edges of it were not clean. The edges quivered. In the jack's glow, I saw a detail that made my mouth water with sudden fear. Along the floorboards where the seeds had scratched, a finer set of markings had appeared. Little parallel lines, not deep, as if something had leaned on its fingers while it learned to pull. "I see you," I said, and I meant it not as a human challenge, but as a declaration that might mean something to a thing built of attention. "I see you." It leaned back, as if the words weighed more than it had anticipated. The jack's flame steadied, found its rhythm, tick, 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 in time with a new sound, water gathering in the gutters outside. Rain had begun, and with it a thin current of air that smelled of wet dirt and rotting leaves. "Stay," I added to the dark, to the house, to myself. I fed the new jack a little more of the fat from the tin. The flame enjoyed it. The light threw a calm, honey circle on the boards. Hob crept from whatever dimension cats keep on reserve for emergencies, and sat with knees tucked under his body, eyes half-lidded, as if the correct ritual had finally resumed. The dark did not vanish. It withdrew the way tide withdraws. Not because it wants to, but because the moon makes a new argument. We waited together, the house and the cat and I, as the rain thickened and the clock on the mantel considered its obligations. After a time that could have been minutes or an hour, it resumed, but now it ticked correctly, as if relieved. I took the dead jack, the one I had betrayed with my breath, and carried it out to the porch. The rain hissed when it touched the skin, tiny freckles appearing and disappearing. I set the empty face on the railing. The windows reflected me, a tall smudge, a stranger. Inside, the new jack's glow warmed the hallway and turned the old photographs into watchful silhouettes. When I came back in, I wiped the knife, cleaned the counter, put the tin back where I'd fetched it. I found a candle stub in a drawer and pressed it into the flesh at the bottom of the new jack to give my makeshift wick a friend. The flame licked both and made a new rhythm of breathing. The house relaxed. The knot voice said nothing else. I slept on the couch because the idea of leaving the jack alone felt rude. Hob settled on my chest like a paperweight to keep me from floating away. Dreams came and brought with them a road I walked and walked that refused to lead anywhere except back to a porch where I had to choose a face. I woke near dawn with a cramp in my neck and the gritty, metallic taste of fear gone stale. The rain had rinsed the world. The old road behind the hedge shone like something recently molted. The new jack still burned, its carved mouth sigil smiling like a wound that had decided to be useful. The old jack on the porch had collapsed in the wet, its face slumped into a grimace that looked more human than I liked. Seeds lay around it like small moons. The note in the kitchen still said what it had said, but I took a pen and added a line below it, a question for Mrs. Keene. What happens if we let it burn all year? I stayed until the sun was fully up, until the ordinary sounds of day, an engine on the road, a bird arguing with itself near the hedge, the rain's last reluctant drips, made the night's logic slide off me. When I finally left, I locked the door, then unlocked it and went back to check the jack. I trimmed the hair wick, added a little of the fat, moved it slightly so its glow could be seen from the porch. It felt like adjusting a collar before a job interview. "You're doing important work," I told the stupid little face. It glowed at me without gratitude. On the drive home, the sky kept snagging my attention. Every roadside pumpkin stand I passed showed faces in rows, corny triangles, goofy fangs, a too-many-teeth grin like a mistake someone had refused to correct. In each, for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw the face I had carved look back, not with recognition, with duty. I slept in my apartment that night with the lights on, the television murmuring to prove the world still existed. Twice I dreamed a hand smudged with tallow touched my cheek and turned my head toward a room I hadn't noticed. When the phone finally buzzed with a message near noon, it was from Mrs. Keene. "Thank you. You did it right. Don't tell anyone." Then, after a spacer, another line. "There's more fat in the freezer if you're back this way next year." I put the phone down. In the blank black of the screen before it slept, I saw my reflection, small and pale and a little overexposed, like one of her dead relatives. Behind my shoulder, in the reflection's dark, a triangle eye narrowed and considered whether I could be trusted with a different cut. I have not told anyone until now. On the calendar, I drew a circle around next Halloween and wrote a single word, watch. At odd times, at red lights, in grocery store lines, when I'm skimming my fingers through my hair and think of fire, my mind reconstructs the moment the candle went out and the night took that long, pleased step. I think of the voice asking me to carve it a door and wonder what shape it would have preferred if I had obliged. I think of doors I have been all my life without knowing, and of the light you keep for others without gratitude. Sometimes, when the apartment goes quiet and the city forgets itself, I turn off every lamp and stand in the dark and tell it what the jack tells it, what light says to the road, not here, not tonight. And if I imagine a weight shifting outside the walls, testing, leaning, promising nothing, I wait until the moment right before it decides again, then strike a match and hold it out in front of me, my hair prickling at the root, my breath a small engine behind the flame. The light is tiny. It is also enough, until it isn't. I agreed to chaperone at the last minute because Lena's mom had a night shift and Gabe's dad had the flu. Just 2 hours, my sister said. They're good kids. Hit 3 blocks and be home by 9. I like the idea of easy points as the fun aunt, and besides, Halloween's supposed to have its fear contained to rubber masks and corn syrup blood. Safety out front, nightmare tucked away in stage fog and plastic bones. We drove to the new development on the edge of town because someone at school told Lena, Old Fox Lane gives out full-sized bars. The GPS thought Old Fox Lane was a logging road. It rerouted me, spun, then happily announced we were arriving at destination a full street early. I turned anyway, rolling over a seam in the asphalt that tickled through the steering wheel like a shiver. Old Fox! Old Fox! Gabe drummed his sneakers against the back of my seat. It's just a cul-de-sac, I said. We'll do a loop. We'll be quick. The street was newer than the map, but older than the houses. You could feel it. The pavement looked poured yesterday without cracks or oil stains, yet the oaks lining both sides were tall enough to crisscross overhead, the way old trees do when they've talked to each other for decades. Wind had matted their leaves into thick drifts that hugged the curb. The houses stood in careful sibling rows, all with front porches and identical black iron railings. Every door had a jack-o'-lantern with the same carved grin, 3 square teeth on top, 1 on the bottom, like a little factory line of smiles. Creepy, Lena said, a little too happily. She was 12 and leaning hard into brave. She adjusted her witch hat and swept her broom toward the nearest walkway. Gabe, 8, had painted his face into a skeleton that made his eyes look too bright. Wait for me, I said, killing the engine. We stick together, okay? Okay, they chorused already halfway up the first path. The house's porch light was on, the universal invitation. A fake cobweb clung to the eaves and the witch silhouette in the window looked store-bought. Normal. The pumpkin hissed quietly, candle tunneling into its own wax. I knocked once, a polite rap. Inside, a TV muttered and someone laughed. No one came. I knocked again, louder. The laughter cut off. Silence. Maybe they left a bowl, Gabe said, peering into the shadows. Lena found it first, tucked beside the pumpkin, an enamel mixing bowl with a handwritten sign. Take what you are owed. The letters were blocky and careful, the kind you print when you want people to take you seriously. What we're owed, I said. That's formal. Gabe giggled and took 2 little wrapped bars. Lena took one, eyes on the door like she dared it to swing open. It didn't. We moved on. The second house had a scarecrow slung on a porch swing, head tilted too far back as if watching the roof. Its pumpkin had the same grin. The bowl was the same enamel, the same sign. The candy wrappers here were old-fashioned, brands I didn't think existed anymore, matte paper instead of shiny plastic that crinkled like dry leaves. My fingers smelled faintly of chalk after touching them, and a sweet, dusty scent rose like attic air. At the third house, the porch boards creaked under us as if something was shifting its weight below. Lena knocked. 2, then 3 taps. Trick or treat, she called, firm. Something tapped back from inside, 3 slow thuds paced like a heartbeat. Probably a decoration, I said, forcing a smile. You 2 get your shares. 3 for each of us? Gabe asked. He always counted by 3s for reasons he wouldn't explain that were very serious in second-grade terms. 2, I said. We don't be greedy. He made a face, then reached. The wind picked up and a plastic skeleton spinner down the path clicked and clicked. Somewhere a dog barked once and shut up like it remembered itself and swallowed the sound. By the fifth house, the kids had a rhythm. Trot, knock, chorus, collect thanks. The bowl and sign system repeated. No one answered their doors. The only voices were recorded. Laughing witches, groaning ghosts, and the occasional TV that cut abruptly to silence as if listening for us. I kept looking for a parent on a step, a grin, a wave. A cat watched us from a windowsill, tail twitching like a metronome. It didn't blink. My phone had one bar, then none, then a clock that hiccuped from 1847 to 1844. Maybe Old Fox Lane is where introverts live, I offered. Maybe, Lena said, but her voice had shifted. The bravado trembled at the edge. She was a smart kid. Kids notice repetition like a pattern you don't want to know you know. We took a pause under a streetlight that hummed a thin electronic whine. I breathed it like medicine. The light made a pale cone around us where our breath showed and drifted like someone else's sighs. The air smelled metallic, like pennies on the tongue. "Look," Gabe said, poking his bag with its skeleton hands printed on the sides. "All the pumpkins have the same face." I looked down the row. He was right. 3 top teeth, 1 bottom. Some grins were longer, some narrow, but they were all the same mouth. And their candles were all burned to the same stub. No more, no less, like someone measured it. "You kids stay here," I said. "I'm going to ask if anyone's actually home." I pointed to a house with the porch light off. "That one might not be playing." "Don't," Lena said softly. "I'll be quick." I went up alone, my boots whispering through the leaves. The dark house had a heavy door with beveled glass and an ornate brass knocker shaped like a fox's head. No pumpkin. No bowl. I knocked once with my knuckles and immediately wished I hadn't. The sound crawled into the wood and away through the frame like it knew where to go. I thought I heard it climb into the walls. Something knocked back, not from the door, from under the porch, as though a hand came up through the joists and pressed 3 careful times on the underside boards right beneath my feet. I stepped backward so quickly I almost tripped on a plastic tombstone. Leaves rattled, and I found myself turning in a circle like a lost dog, stupid and embarrassed, the kind of fear that comes before the real thing. When I rejoined the kids, there were 3 of them: Lena, Gabe, and a smaller one I didn't recognize, hand tucked in Lena's sleeve, face hidden beneath a cheap ghost costume, an old sheet with 2 eye holes cut in off-center circles. The sheet dragged, edges gray with street dust. "Who?" The word came out too loud. "This is Eli," Lena said, the instant lie of a child who doesn't want to get in trouble. "He's from school. He lost his group." "Hi," the little ghost said from behind the fabric. The voice was distant. It might have been a boy, might have been a girl, might have been recorded. "Which school?" I asked. "Mine," Lena said quickly. Too quickly. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, toward the next porch. "Look," Gabe said, delighted. He held up a candy bar as thick as my wrist. The wrapper was printed with a design I knew from childhood. The brand had been discontinued when I was 11. I remembered the way the caramel pulled like hot glue and the peanuts were soft. I also remembered the recall. Salmonella or razor rumors, I didn't remember which. "Let me see that," I said. "Mine," he said, clutching it. I must have made a face because my tone softened. "I'm not taking it, bud. I just want a picture. Hold it up." I took a photo. The screen showed 2 children, Lena, Gabe, and a smear behind them where a third should be, an elongated shadow that ran up the lamppost and into the bare branches like ink dropped in water. When I looked up, Eli stood exactly where the smear had been, head canted at the same angle. "I think we should head back to the car," I said. "Just 1 more street," Lena said. That was the plan. 3 streets. Kids like clean numbers. "Fine," I said, but my voice wasn't fine. Eli made a sound like humming. It might have been the streetlight. It might have been my teeth. As we turned down the curve of the cul-de-sac, my feet expected the slope to change, to start back toward the car, but the road didn't curve so much as fold. The same houses unfolded in front of us again. The scarecrow, the cat, the witch silhouette. We had come back to where we started without turning. The streetlight hummed. The fox-head knocker glinted. The pumpkins all smiled their little factory smiles. "Shortcut," Gabe said, not joking. "Stay close," I said, and meant it. Eli tugged at Lena. 3 knocks, Eli said from the sheet. "Or the street sleeps." "That's not a thing," I told the air. "It's late. 2 more houses and we go." They trotted up the next walk. The porch groaned like a throat. I watched their silhouettes cross the door. I watched the pumpkin wag its little tooth. Knock, knock, knock. The knocks didn't echo inside. They rolled along the boards, into the railing, down the steps, and into the walkway like a marble finding the groove. I felt them through the soles of my feet. I could trace them, if I wanted, all the way to the seam I had driven over, the shiver seam where Old Fox Lane joined the rest of the world. "Trick or treat!" 3 voices sang. This door did open, slow and patient, as if whatever waited had hands on both sides of the knob. The crack showed a warm hall with a runner rug. A grandfather clock ticked. A faint cinnamon smell drifted out, safe as pie. The kids leaned forward without meaning to. I did too. A woman's voice said, "Happy Halloween," in a friendly enough tone that I found my mouth forming the word thanks before I thought it. But the shape behind the door wasn't a woman. It was a shadow that had learned a shape, thick and gray, curved in all the places a person is curved but missing the angles. It was behind the crack, pressed to it like a face to a finger, and when it spoke, the word came from the doorframe itself. Eli went first, toes over the threshold. I grabbed the back of the sheet. My hand closed on fabric that was colder than the night air, damp like fog. I yanked, hard. The sheet came away in my hand empty, and the door sighed wider in a way that made the runner rug curl. "Run," I said. My voice cracked on the first try. "Run." But the street had been listening, and it didn't take orders from me. The porch lights down the block pulsed off in a ripple as if something had breathed in. The wind went still. There was a deep, dull knocking from below the ground, like the place itself tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Each tap answered from a different direction. A hollow porch post, a gutter, a mailbox door. "Don't panic," I told the kids, which is the dumbest sentence in the world, but you have to say something when a door is opening onto a clock that ticks without a pendulum and a voice that doesn't bother with a mouth. Lena's hand found mine, bones bird-light, strong. Gabe's bag banged my knee. Eli stood where the sheet had been, newly visible without cover, a small figure in old-fashioned clothes, the kind a last-minute ghost hides. Their face was almost ordinary, except for the eyes, which didn't reflect the porch light and didn't quite hold still in their sockets, like fish under ice. "3 knocks," Eli said softly, "or the street goes hungry, and then it takes big meals." "Let it starve," I said, and reached with my free hand for the pumpkin. The knife-carved mouth was thin, the candle stub was a little column, steady. I didn't think. I grabbed it and crushed the softening walls inward. The mouth tore. The smell of damp, moldy vegetables slapped hot and wet into the air. Seeds smeared my palm. The light went out, and the street made a small, surprised sound, like a record skipping. "You're not supposed to do that," and for the first time the voice had a direction. Above us. The oaks whispered in language I didn't want. I yanked the kids, feeling how fast fear makes you strong. We stumbled down the steps. The door swung wide, wider than physics, wider than hinges, and the hallway's runner unrolled toward us across the threshold like a tongue. It slapped over the porch boards and kept going, a spilled path that shouldn't move but did. The grandfather clock kept ticking, and every few ticks something in it clicked with the sound of a tooth seating properly. "Off the path," I said. "Off, off, off." We ran at an angle, cutting across the lawn's slick grass. The runner lashed, missed our heels. It dragged at the leaves, and they didn't rustle. They whispered numbers. 1, 2, 3. 3, 2, 1. We made it past the reach of the rug. The knocks from the ground were closer now, more excited. The house ahead of us flicked its porch light on, off, in a strobe that made Gabe stagger, disoriented. I threw my arm around his shoulders and half carried him, half pushed him forward. "You have to pay," Eli said. The voice was still soft and not unkind, but something behind it had woken up and turned around. "You took what you were owed." "I'll pay," I panted. "We'll pay. Take it." I ripped Gabe's bag open and candy spilled, clacking onto the pavement like a storm of bright bones. Lena poured her haul out too, trembling so hard the wrappers shook with their own static. The candy slid toward the seam in the road, gathering, turning in place. It gathered by 2s and 1s, then reorganized into groups of 3. The street purred. The runner had stopped. The door had not. If I looked at it directly, it was just a door. Peripheral, it was an absence. The clock ticked inside it, and I thought, absurdly, of the way my own hallway sounded late at night. Pipes ticking, floor settling, familiar joints cracking. You could get used to any house. You could even get used to a hungry one. Pay and go, I told the kids. Don't stop. We ran. The cul-de-sac folded again. It tried to return us to the beginning, but we kept to the tree lawns, to the grass where the knocking didn't carry as cleanly, and the roots pushed up at the surface like a rib cage. My breath tore at my throat. The oaks let a handful of leaves go all at once in a hush. Somewhere behind us the door shut, gently, like fingers leaving a back. My car sat under the humming streetlight as though it had always been there. The seam in the road waited, blacker than the asphalt around it. The candy that had organized itself had shivered into the crack and disappeared. I couldn't think about where candy went in a street's stomach. I hit the fob. The car beeped like an apology. I shoved the kids into the back, slammed the doors, dove into the front seat, and wrenched the engine awake. "Seat belts," I gasped. "On," Lena said, hands shaking on the buckle. "On," Gabe echoed, and I heard the click. In the rear view, Eli sat very still, head turned not toward me but at the window, as if listening to the glass. "You too," I said. "Seat belt." Eli turned slowly. The eyes did their fish-under-ice slide. "I don't need one," Eli said. "We're not moving until you buckle in." "We will move," Eli said, and the car's clock blinked 1913, then 1910 again, like it couldn't count down without permission. "Seat belt," I said, voice low, the same way I told my dog to drop a dead thing, the same way my mother told me to put the knife down when I was 5 and cutting plastic into confetti. Some edges of you survive from childhood. They come in handy. I held Eli's gaze as if it were a person's, and finally, with a slow, careful motion, Eli reached for the belt and drew it across their lap. The click when it seated was louder than it should have been. I drove. The tires rolled over the seam and the wheel shook, a shudder like the aftersob of a child who's cried itself quiet. The knock stopped. The humming stopped. The pumpkins in the rear view were only pumpkins again, a polite line of neighbors with identical taste. We made it to the main road. We made it to my sister's house alive. We spilled into the light like survivors out of a tunnel. The kitchen smelled like soap and garlic and nothing dead. I poured water with hands that remembered the weight of the pumpkin. Lena went straight to the bathroom and shut the door and didn't come out for a long time. Gabe sat at the table and stared at his empty bag with the skeleton hands on it, as if he couldn't remember what it was for. When I looked up, Eli stood in the doorway between kitchen and hall, sheetless, expressionless, the kind of child you can lose in a crowd because their face is made of everyone you've ever known. My sister stepped around Eli without seeing, moving to take my shoulders in her hands. "You look awful," she said, voice scolding because fear always makes us scold the living. "What happened?" "Old Fox Lane is weird," I said, which was almost the truth and also nothing. She sighed a little. "Kids hype everything. Did you get any videos? Oh, and—" She stopped. "Who's this?" "Eli," I said before I thought. My mouth had already formed the shape the street liked. "From school." My sister smiled, the automatic adult smile that says strange child in my house and don't make this awkward. "Hello, Eli. Do I know your parents?" Eli tilted their head at a thoughtful angle that would probably be charming in daylight. "You will," Eli said, and the overhead light flickered as if something climbed into the bulb to warm its hands. That night, I did what adults do to make the world rational. I Googled Old Fox Lane. Nothing. I told myself the neighborhood was one street over with a similar name. I told myself we were spooked and hypersensitive and the kids would recover. I told myself a lot of things in a lot of voices until my own sounded unconvincing. I slept with the bedroom door closed and the closet shut. At 3 a.m, I woke to the sound of knocking, not from the front door. From the wall behind my headboard, 3 careful raps, paced like a heartbeat. I sat up, heart hammering, sweat cold. The house was very quiet, the kind of quiet that listens. I held my breath. Silence stretched long enough to become almost funny. I almost laughed in that stupid relief way, and then knock, 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 this time from under the bed. Wood on wood, as if Knuckles had found joists to speak through. The rhythm traveled into the floor and away, following beams that led to the stairs, and down, and to the front hall, and to my door. My door is old, the paint is chipped, the brass knob is cool to the touch most nights. Tonight, through the wood, I felt warmth like breath. When the knocking came again, it was from the other side of the door, inches from my knees. And then, very softly, Eli's voice through the panel. "You forgot to say thank you." My mouth opened. I don't know what I would have said. Sorry, maybe, or please. Or nothing, the kind of words that make deals in old places. Before I could choose, another sound joined it, high and eager, a child's sleepy shuffle and whisper. Gabe, padding down the hall to use the bathroom, his hand on the wall for balance, the wall that had learned to speak. I moved faster than thought. The door swung open and the hall lamp caught my own face in the mirror at the end, pale as paper. Gabe blinked up at me, hair flattened on one side. He smiled, automatic. "Auntie?" "Bathroom," I said, too fast, too bright. "Go on," he went. Eli stood in the hall at the edge of the lamplight, where the shadow broke the ankles of the light and made two impossible silhouettes. Eli looked at me the way kids do when they're deciding whether to cry. The eyes shifted and stilled. Eli raised one small hand. It made a fist and knocked once on the air. Twice. Thrice. I did the stupidest and bravest thing I will ever do. I knocked back, not 3, 4. A new number, wrong. Breaking the pattern is a prayer or a curse, depending who hears you. The house shuddered, a dog hearing its name mispronounced. The knocks stuttered and lost their spine. I took Eli's wrist, cold, and spoke like I'd swallowed iron filings. "Thank you," I said. I didn't know who I was saying it to, but I said it hard. "Now go." Eli looked down at the little hand in my grip. The wrist turned under my fingers with a strength I hadn't felt before, something tendony that didn't care how human bones hinge. The eyes slid and fixed on mine. "You'll have to bring more next year," Eli said, almost cheerful, like planning a party. 3 streets, 3 bowls, what you are owed." "No," I said. "Yes," Eli said, not as a threat but as a statement of weather. "Or it eats when it's hungry." Gabe flushed the toilet. The house's pipes moaned their ordinary moan. The ordinary hum came back to the electricity, cheap and stupid and blessed. Eli's wrist cooled under my fingers until it felt like a normal child's, smaller than my hand. In the morning, Old Fox Lane wasn't on any map again. The kids wouldn't talk about it. Lena put her broom in the back of her closet and shut the door and piled shoes in front of it like sandbags. Gabe asked me not to throw away his skeleton bag. "For next time," he said haltingly, and I closed my eyes before I nodded. I could tell myself we'd go somewhere else next Halloween. I could tell myself we'd leave the porch light off, move to an apartment, stop answering the door. But at dusk now, in that hour when you can't tell if the sky is about to give up blue, I hear the faintest knocking travel through the neighborhood and into the bones of my house, polite as a bad dream. It isn't asking permission. It's keeping time. It's early yet. There are 11 months between hunger and manners. But calendars are an invention. Streets have their own clocks. And somewhere just past where the GPS gives up and tells you to turn around, a cul-de-sac smiles with 3 teeth on top, 1 on the bottom, patient as a promise, and counts to 3. I told myself I wasn't hiding. I told myself I needed quiet, a night without costumes or noise, or the complicated ritual of pretending I wasn't still thinking about the last year. When Claire offered me a house-sitting gig in a neighborhood famous for Halloween, I said yes because the money was good and because I thought I could enjoy it at a remove. Answer the door, hand out candy, go back to a book that wouldn't hold me anyway. The house itself felt like a borrowed memory, narrow and tall, a century-old place with a steep porch and leaded glass that turned the street into smears of amber and gray. The air inside had a polite, careful smell. Lemon oil on wood, old paper, a suggestion of mothballs and something sweet, like spilled cider dried into the floorboards decades ago. In the hallway stood a wobbly little table with a blue and white bowl of wrapped caramels and a note from Claire. "Help yourself. Leave the porch light on for the kids. Please don't blow out the jack-o'-lantern, neighborhood tradition." The pumpkin on the railing looked handmade, heavy-lidded eyes and a pointed grin, its candle already a stub. A little paper banner hung across the doorframe, triangles of orange and black that trembled when the door opened to let in colder air. I set my bag down, tested the old lamps with their pull chains, listened to the house get used to me. Pipes ticked. Floorboards answered my weight with groans the way a person might complain and then settle. By 6, the sky had the color of bruised fruit. The first trick-or-treaters arrived in a clatter of plastic swords and laughter, their parents loitering at the bottom of the steps, faces upturned like moons. I stood with the door open, the warm lamp light spilling over small masks and painted cheeks, distributing candy with the variations of voice you use for children, admiring, conspiratorial, indulgent. It was pleasant. It was simple. The bowl of caramels decreased and then the backup bags took their turn, and I found a rhythm. Door, smile, handful, happy Halloween, shut, step back through the smell of wax and the faint iron tinge of radiator heat. A few kids peered around my legs and asked about the narrow staircase that rose like a question mark from the entryway. Just an old house, I said. Just stairs. They left fingerprints on the leaded glass, shining ovals that caught the light like tiny pale fogs. I wiped them away and watched the street grow more shadow than shape. A wind came up, conspiratorial in the trees. The paper banner whispered. By 9:30 the stragglers came. Teenagers too cool for buckets, wearing only token costumes, a smudged skull on one cheek, devil horns on a beanie. They said thanks without looking. Someone's music thumped a street over. The jack-o'-lantern candle drowned in its own wax and sputtered back to life as if remembering it had a job to do. I made tea. I watched the steam climb and unravel. For a few minutes there was silence so complete, I felt the house appraise me. I opened a book and the words slid off my mind like rain off glass. I closed it. The radiator pinged again, soft metallic notes like something trying to speak through the walls. At 10, a knock. Instinct sent me to the door with the bowl. A small figure stood on the top step, coat zipped tight, a rubber mask with big cartoon eyes. The mask was nothing special, generic cheap plastic, glossy and expressionless, but it had a slit of a mouth that seemed to move when the figure breathed. No parent hovered on the sidewalk. The street had thinned to parked cars and occasional movement behind curtained windows. Late night, I tried and held out the candy. The masked head tilted, not like a nod but like the angle you give a puzzle you don't trust. The little body didn't reach for the bowl. I listened for footsteps on the sidewalk, a voice urging hurry, but the only sound was the banner's dry paper flutter and a dog barking far away, punctured by the wind. "Trick or treat?" I prompted. A voice came from the mask, not muffled as much as oddly flat, as if replayed from an old recording. "Are you alone?" I smiled the way you do when a kid tries a line meant to spook. "Just me tonight," I said, because that felt harmless. "But I've got enough candy for an army." The figure didn't move. The jack-o'-lantern flame shivered. The wind ran a cold finger down my spine. I changed the topic the way you would with a timid child and dropped 2 caramels into a small, unseen hand. The figure took them without looking, without speaking, then stepped sideways off the porch, down the stairs in movements too precise to be casual. Halfway down, their heads snapped toward me again, fast, bird-like. The big eyes caught the porch light and gleamed. Then the kid was gone into the dark between bush and gate, quick as if the house had never been. I shut the door and laughed to myself, a sound that didn't quite belong to me. The paper triangles clinked like teeth. At 10:30, I turned off the porch light. I stood with my hand on the switch and felt a small resistance, as if an etiquette took exception to the act, like hanging up on someone before they finish saying goodbye. The note had said, "Please don't blow out the jack-o'-lantern." It hadn't said anything about the porch light, and tradition was not, strictly speaking, my problem. I left the pumpkin burning and went back into the living room, where the sofa smelled faintly of old lavender. The house settled. The heat clicked on and moved through the radiators with liquid whispers. In the kitchen, an old chrome clock ticked audibly, the minute hand jerking forward like a dog straining against its leash. I pulled the blue and white bowl closer and discovered it was heavier than it looked, as if the porcelain had a dense heart. On its bottom, there were delicate painted vines and a word in handwriting that looked like brushstrokes. Remember. It struck me as one of those overly sentimental inscriptions. It struck me as something that households like this always had. I turned the bowl back over and told myself to stop making meaning out of patterns. The tea had cooled. The book sighed open in my lap. At 11, the audible kind of silence arrived. The street, too, had gone to bed. When the knock came, it bloomed in that silence like a pulse. 3 gentle taps. Not urgent. Polite. I didn't move immediately. Something in me stalled, listening for the pause between knocks, for voices, for the aftersound of footsteps. Nothing. Just the old house inhaling and exhaling around me, as if it had lungs. I got up anyway, because it's what you do, because people get lost or hurt or forget what time it is. At the door, I looked through the beveled peephole. The world on the other side bulged and shimmered. I saw only the top step and, faintly, the pumpkin's sleepy glow. No one. I opened the door a crack, chain still latched. Cold rushed in, smelling of blown leaves and distant damp. The jack-o'-lantern flame leaned and recovered. The porch boards glistened slightly, though there had been no rain. The darkness crouched at the foot of the steps as if waiting to be fed. "Hello?" I called, feeling foolish. I listened for a child's sniff, a parent's apology. A small scrape came from the side yard, the sound of shoe on stone, and then a soft voice, close enough to touch, said, "I'm here." I couldn't see anyone. The voice seemed to have no source at all, neither far nor near, neither above nor below. It just was, like what you hear in a dream right before you wake. "Are you okay?" I asked. The paper banner stirred. The candle flared. The wind nosed at the crack and nudged the door against the chain with a patient bump, once, twice. The voice said, "You said you were alone." A heat that felt like embarrassment and like anger ran through me, a fight against being made a fool by a prank. "It's late," I said, with an adultness that surprised me. "Go home." For a moment there was no answer. Then the voice, still flat, still like replay, said, "Invite me." The request, ridiculous in context, took all the warmth from my hands. I closed the door, set the bolt out of habit more than belief. The laugh that came out of me then sounded brittle. I checked the windows. I told myself it was just older kids playing at urban legend. The radiator in the hall whispered and clicked. The little table trembled slightly as if someone had brushed it on their way to the kitchen. In the parlor, the book laid open to a page I didn't recognize. A bookmark I'd tucked neatly was on the floor, an accusation of neglect. I picked it up and then stood in the middle of the room, without purpose, listening. Right then, like a message slipped under a door, the smell of the jack-o'-lantern's candle thickened, smoky and greasy, the way a candle smells when it's about to drown. The pumpkin's glow dimmed and brightened rapidly, as if something outside were cupping it to breathe it out. Claire's note tapped under my magnet on the fridge, barely a whisper. "Please don't blow out the jack-o'-lantern. Neighborhood tradition." I plucked it free and turned it over. On the back, in smaller script I hadn't noticed, a postscript. "If you hear the late knock, don't answer. Don't say your name. Don't invite. Leave the pumpkin burning until dawn." My stomach made a small, stubborn knot. I carried the note to the door, my eyes on the pumpkin's uncertain light. The peephole showed me nothing again, a distortion of porch and glow. Then the knock came. Not on the door this time, but from the wall to my left. 3 soft taps from inside the house. I turned so fast the hallway swayed. The staircase was only shadow and banister, the runner a strip of darkness. The second knock came from somewhere beneath me, from the floorboards. The third traveled up the wall and into the ceiling as if moving along the bones of the house, polite, patient, hunting for the right entrance. The voice, almost agreeable, said, "I'll wait." I don't remember deciding to do it. I only remember the pumpkin guttering again, the flame licking low, and my body moving on that singular, desperate axis of no. I grabbed my coat and went onto the porch, shouldered the door wide, and bent toward the jack-o'-lantern to relight. Though there was nothing to set aflame, the candle was already burning, however weakly. The pumpkin smelled like singed sugar and rot. The carved mouth's grin looked less mischievous now, more tired. "Leave it," a voice chided pleasantly from the gate. "It doesn't matter if the light goes out. It only matters if you ask me in." There it stood, the small figure in the generic mask, 1 foot on the path stone, 1 on the bottom step, exactly between coming and going. The mask's cartoon eyes seemed to track me as if it could see through the cheap plastic. In the figure's left hand sat the caramels, still wrapped, untouched. "I don't have any more candy," I said, because it was what my brain could manage. "I'm not hungry." The voice didn't come from the space behind the mask. It felt like it arrived from the space between my ribs, a ventriloquist act done with organs I am owed. The porch light was off. The pumpkin's thin glow did strange things to the figure's outline. It looked less like a child in a coat, and more like the idea of a child, drawn in with hard pencil lines that didn't quite connect. The wind pressed at my back like a hand urging me to be quick about something I didn't understand. "What do you want?" I whispered. "The last invitation," it said. There's a peculiar way old fear works. It picks up old stories you don't believe in until the moment their shapes fit the space you're in. I thought of vampire rules and old tales told around October tables, of doorways and thresholds, of boundary lines you're meant to respect even if you can't say why. The figure took one silent step up, and the wood complained faintly under a weight that felt metaphorical, like a debt taking physical form. "Leave," I tried, and the word didn't reach it. It stood in the dim, waiting for language that mattered. The house's pipes sighed, a tired, percussive whisper. The knocks restarted, almost kindly, inside the walls behind me, as if offering to find any aperture that would do. I forced myself to slow down. "What happens if I don't?" I asked. I couldn't see the figure's mouth through the slit. I couldn't imagine its real one behind the rubber. "You'll answer eventually," it said. "Or you won't. But then I'll wait for the next alone one. Tradition doesn't skip a house. It only waits. And if I do, I come in. Sometimes you need a ridiculous instrument to feel like you can do anything at all." I set the bowl of caramels on the porch rail, reached into my coat pocket, and pulled out my keys. The one I never used, the one that looked like a small forbidden word, had a tiny rough edge from a bad cut. I scraped it across my thumb, bright and sharp as a swear. It hurt in a clarifying way. I let the blood fall in a thin arc across the top step, a petty barrier, a childish line. I had, very suddenly, the bone-deep conviction that lines mattered tonight. The masked head cocked. "That's not what I asked for." "Neither is your presence," I said, and for a ridiculous moment anger steadied me. "You can't have my name. You can't have the threshold. You can't have the light." I reached for the jack-o'-lantern then, intending to lift it and bring it inside where the flame might be less at the wind's mercy. It was heavier than it looked, and hot where the lid had warmed the rind. When I raised it, tilting it to my chest, the carving threw a grinning orange face against the figure and the fence beyond, and I saw, not what stood there, but what the light made of it. It had the outline of a child, yes, but the inside of it was the wrong kind of empty, as if the bones had been erased and the space refilled with dark water. The candlelight didn't cling to it. It slid off, like oil ignoring the wetness of a stone. The face inside the mask was a hole whose edges were too neat. It was the exact shape of a person who had been gently cut out of the world. I took a step backward without thinking. The pumpkin wavered in my hands. "Invite me," the voice repeated pleasantly from inside my sternum. "No," I said, and my voice had a grain to it I didn't recognize. The figure took the next step. My bloodline glistened on the plank between us, thin as a vein drawn on a map. The figure stopped there, tilted its head to consider the mark, and waited again with an awful patience that made me wish for anger over any other emotion, because anger at least rushed and passed like a storm. Inside the house, the gentle knocking grew less polite. It sounded like nails across wood. It sounded like a tiny hand gliding along baseboards in search of a gap. The lamps quivered, just a blink, and the kitchen clock hiccuped and resumed. The paper banner tapped together, a jittery clatter that could, if you wanted, be translated, "Let me in, let me in, let me in." I had one match left, a kitchen kind, long and square. I struck it against the seam in the porch post, where old paint had made a rough notebook of layers, and it bloomed up sulphurous, a little sun you can hold. I lowered it to the jack-o'-lantern candle that was already burning, a redundancy that made me feel foolish, then touched the flame to the paper banner instead. Fire traveled the twine and triangles with more eagerness than a rational world would grant it. It dashed along in tiny, hungry steps, crackling soft as whispered jokes, and then the banner dropped its blazing triangles at the figure's feet, smoking petals, and the smell of scorched ink and glue filled the space between us. The masked head turned toward the falling cinders and then back to me. The voice that lived under my ribcage laughed once, like the sound of a coin flipping and never landing. "Tradition," it said, delighted. "You do remember." It stepped again and stopped on the wrong side of the bloodline, and my breath caught, but it didn't cross. It stood so close to the porch now that if I had thrown the pumpkin, I might have knocked the mask off. I thought of doing it, of exposing whatever absence wore that face, but the thought made a cold electrical current crawl over my scalp. Some doors you don't open, even to prove they're real. "How long do you wait?" I asked quietly, because the other option was to scream or run, and both felt like invitations of their own. "How long will you stand there if I don't ask you in?" "Until morning," it said. "Until the first bird sings, until the street remembers the sound of people, or until you take pity. It is cold to be out here without a name." Something in that, "without a name," landed in me with the thud of a dropped book. I remembered the word painted on the underside of the porcelain. Remember. I remembered how easy it had been to say, early and without thinking, "Just me tonight." The way the mask had tilted at the information, the way the porch had listened. I set the pumpkin down with care. The flame inside it darted like a heart. I stepped backward over the threshold, my eyes tight on the figure as if it might sprint in the moment I blinked, and closed the door with a slowness that made my skin itch. The latch engaged. The bolt slid home. For a few seconds, I stood with my forehead against the wood, the warmth of the house flattening the cold that had attached itself to me outside. I didn't blow out the pumpkin. I sat on the bottom step of the staircase with my hands under my thighs like a child and watched the door and listened to the knocks move along the house's bones, searching. I don't know how long I sat there. I know that at some point the knocks softened and then paused, and then resumed from farther away, like a tide pulling back to gather itself. I know that the kitchen clock's hands moved without sound for a while, as if time were tiptoeing around the situation. Just after midnight, the voice spoke again, not through the door and not through my chest. It came down from the ceiling like rain. "You could save someone else. Let me in, and I will not return next year. I will stay here. You could keep the next alone one safe." I thought of the mask every year on this step, the small hand holding candy it would never eat, the patient tilt of its head. I thought of the neat hole in the world where its face should be. I thought of 100 nights like this and 100 people making choices. The house made a sound like a sigh. The radiator stuttered, recovered. "I'm not home," I said finally, to the door, to the walls, to whatever else listened. "I'm just the house sitter." Silence answered, then the gentlest laugh, as if some old joke had been told perfectly for the 1,000th time. "You'll do," it said. The rest of the night became a ritual of not doing. I didn't speak my name, and I didn't open the door, and when the flame in the jack-o'-lantern guttered, I tilted the pumpkin and the candle found itself again. The knocks moved, circled, came back like a skipping record. Once, at 2, the peephole showed a closer darkness than the porch could account for, and I stepped back from it as if it could inhale me through glass. Toward 5, the house changed. It's a thing you can feel if you're awake for it. The air shifts, the darkness loosens. The knocks retreated as a storm retreats, 1 second here and the next 10 blocks down. A bird scolded somewhere as if at a late cat. The street made a soft noise, the first car, I think, splashing slow through last night's leaves. On the porch, the pumpkin flame wavered in the thin blue, and then someone breathed out a long, tired breath that misted the glass for an instant and was gone. I opened the door just after 6, when the sky had become milk, and the porch smelled of cooled ash. The paper banner existed only as black confetti near the steps. There were small, wet footprints on the top plank, turned toward the door and then away. They stopped at the mark where my blood had dried and thinned to nothing. Beyond, the path stones held the memory of a weight leaving, light as the end of a sentence. On the railing, the porcelain bowl sat heavy as ever. Inside there was a single wrapped caramel, and under it, pressed flat as a pressed flower, a note in that same brush-written hand. "Thank you for keeping the light, C." I turned it over, half expecting instructions or a blessing, but the back was clean. I lifted the bowl and saw the word painted there again, finial flourishes neat and certain. Remember. For reasons I don't fully understand, I carried the bowl into the kitchen and washed it by hand, warm water and the thin squeak of porcelain at a fingertip. When I dried it, it was warm as a living thing. When Claire returned later that morning and asked the usual questions, "Everything okay? Any problems?" I said fine, and heard my voice like a dubbed track slightly out of sync with the scene. She glanced at the scorched bits of paper near the steps. Her mouth tightened, then softened, a private expression moving through her like a weather front you don't bring up in conversation. "Thanks for keeping the pumpkin," she said, and her tone made the words a password for survivors. Some people get spooked. I didn't tell her about the voice or the footprints or the way the knocks learned the shape of the house. I didn't tell her the truth I had felt as a pressure in the room, as a certainty under my limits, that it would come back, that it would wait again, that it would ask, that the only thing that would change year to year was who opened the door. That night, in my own apartment, I lit a stubby candle in an old jam jar and set it on the windowsill and didn't look at it for a long time. Outside, the last plastic pumpkins still sagged on porches, their faces imploded. Inside, the clock on my stove held its green, indifferent 12. When I finally looked at the candle, its flame leaned as if listening to a voice I couldn't hear. Around midnight, not the next night but the one after, I woke to a sound that was not a knock, exactly, but had the same shape. 3 soft pulses against the inside of my chest, polite, patient, as if something were rapping on the door of my name. I didn't answer. I don't know how long I can keep not answering. I keep the light. I remember. And sometimes even now, when the radiator sighs and the hallway's shadows lengthen, I think I smell smoke and sugar, and I wonder whether I am still alone, or whether that's the trick at the center of it, that none of us are, not really, after we open the door even once.